Hello there. If it's Wednesday at noon, it must be Tiny Desk sermon time. Welcome to another chance to look at the scripture readings for the coming week and see what my tiny brain is doing to prepare a sermon for this Sunday. This Sunday is Reformation Sunday, the 505th anniversary of the start of the Reformation, or at least the way we think of it, which is the Martin Luther posting his 95 theses or 95 tweets, it might be today. And it's a day to celebrate the power of the gospel to renew the church. There's a set of readings that are assigned for Reformation Sunday, and they're the same every year. And they're sort of very straightforward, sort of Lutheran theological texts about grace and faith and truth. They're great readings, but I frankly get tired of preaching on the same readings every year. So some years I use the assigned lectionary readings for the same Sunday. This Sunday is lectionary 31. So we're going to look at those readings and think about them both for what they're saying to us as well as what they might be saying in the context of thinking about the Reformation and the Lutheran understanding of the gospel. So with that, you can see that the first reading for Sunday is from Isaiah, and there's just a snippet of it I want to show you because it's chosen to connect directly to the gospel reading, which is Luke 19. So let me just read the last part of Isaiah. This is a typical prophetic utterance where the prophet is criticizing Israel for being focused on their worship life, but not on their ethical life. Assuming that if you do worship right, you don't have to care for your neighbor in need. That just doesn't matter. And the prophets always say, no, true worship always includes caring for your neighbor. So Isaiah says here at the end, well, actually it's in the middle. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. So that's the very traditional prophetic understanding of what it means to follow and worship God faithfully. None of it is meant to be dismissive of worship, liturgy, ritual, all of those things, but that those things can become deceptive or a trap if we use them to not see what true worship of God leads us to do in our lives and in the world. So that's a good text. Now let's see what that has to do with Luke. Luke 19 begins with the story of Zacchaeus, the well-known story. Many children sing songs about it and so forth. But there are a few things that maybe can catch our attention this time. Let me read the text and we'll go from there. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. So let me just stop. In Luke's gospel, to hear those two things, chief tax collector and rich, should perk up our ears. That's a huge issue in Luke's gospel. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and save the lost. All right. This is a really enigmatic key story in Luke's gospel. There are a number of them, but it really illustrates in several ways what Luke's gospel thinks the gospel is about. Let's go back to the beginning. Again, Zacchaeus is described as a chief tax collector and was rich. So we heard about tax collector last week. Tax collector is that thing that when you hear it, you're supposed to go boo. Somebody who had a contractual amount of money to pay to Rome, and anything above that he could keep for himself. And so tax collectors often were rich because they would force people to pay as much as they could get out of them. So nobody liked them. And you can see the crowd is not happy about Jesus acknowledging this guy and hanging out with him. That he was a chief tax collector tells you that he's really corrupt. He's really at the top of this pyramid scheme. Maybe he extorts money out of the tax collectors who get money out of the people. So he's sitting at the top of one of these, multi-marketing schemes that people sometimes get caught up in today. So then we get the most interesting line to interpret in the whole text. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. Of course, the traditional interpretation of the text is that Zacchaeus is short, and so far he can't see above the people in the crowd, so he climbs up a tree so he can see Jesus. But, as some interpreters have pointed out, the Greek is ambiguous as to who it is that is short in stature. It could be Jesus, which is very interesting to ponder, because you might not imagine Jesus as being short. Usually we think of, people of power and importance, of, heroes or whatever, as generally being tall. But if Jesus was short and the crowd was around him, that would also mean that Zacchaeus could not see Jesus. It doesn't particularly affect the story, but we have such a traditional way of thinking about the story that Zacchaeus is short, which may very well be right. It's just fascinating to think about that the Greek could be interpreted either way, and to ponder, well, what would it mean if Jesus was short? How would that affect how we view him, how we think about him in the context of other stories? Nobody else describes Jesus' appearance really anywhere. So, just an interesting thought. So he climbs ahead. He goes ahead. He climbs up a tree, so he could see who Jesus was. Who is this person that people are getting so excited about? But then what happens is Jesus gets there, and I'm sure Zacchaeus sees Jesus, but the story tells us that Jesus saw Zacchaeus. Jesus got there and he looked up and he said to Zacchaeus, "Hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." And Zacchaeus hurried down and was happy to welcome Jesus. Then we get the grumpy crowd scene. And the issue is that Zacchaeus is a, quote, sinner. And of course, Jesus is constantly hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. And here, Zacchaeus is both, according to the crowd. And then something happens. Zacchaeus, almost, it seems, miraculously or instantaneously, is transformed to do something that he hadn't been doing. He's a rich man. He's going to give away half of his possessions off the top to the poor. And then, for all the people that he has defrauded, or forced people to pay more than they had to, he's going to pay back 4 times as much. I wonder if Zacchaeus has anything left after following through on this astounding statement of how he's going to respond to Jesus welcoming him. It's hard to say. And Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house. So the interesting question is, what does that word salvation mean? To say that salvation has come to this house, what does that mean? Maybe our sort of traditional or maybe common interpretation of the word salvation there means that, well, Zacchaeus got saved, meaning now Zacchaeus is right with God, and therefore when Zacchaeus dies, he's going to go to be with God instead of some bad place. But the word salvation here is really about what's happening in this moment. It also includes that Zacchaeus has come into a new relationship with God. And he's come into a new relationship with himself, which I want to come back to. But the salvation that has come to this house is enacted in Zacchaeus' act of generosity, of restorative justice, of care for the poor. That is the salvation that Jesus is recognizing. Because salvation is about healing and restoring and putting the world right. So the whole Gospel of Luke, imagines this salvation, this that Jesus inaugurates a change in the world, a change in us that leads to the world being put right, which means that the poor are lifted up and the wealthy and the proud are brought down and humbled. And sometimes wealthy people in the Gospel of Luke are negative characters who cannot respond to the good news. They're too attached to their wealth and their power, and they go away sad. That story actually was just told before this one in Luke's Gospel. But sometimes people who are wealthy in Luke and in Luke's sequel, the book of Acts, respond positively to the gospel, and they are seen as exemplars of faith. And it's important to see that because you could read Luke's gospel or other things and say, well, it's, poor people are good, wealthy people are bad. Now, everybody has an opportunity to respond to the gospel, but we do it from different places. Sometimes for the poor, the lowly, to respond to the gospel is to be lifted up, is to allow the good news to tell you that you are not a person of lowly status in God's eyes, and that changes your life. Here, it's a wealthy person saying, my status before God does not depend on my wealth, and therefore I can be free to let it go to help my neighbor in need. So Zacchaeus, curiously enough, here he is, he's a rich chief tax collector. And whether he's short or Jesus is short, he climbs up a tree. So here is a very visual, literal image of somebody being up high. And Jesus comes along, and what happens? Zacchaeus comes down from the tree. He comes back down to a lowly place, you might say. And then he is so transformed by Jesus' hospitality and inclusion and recognition of him that Zacchaeus responds with this act of generosity and restorative justice. So Zacchaeus here is enacting the gospel the way Luke sees it. He's the wealthy and the proud, and he's coming down here. And that Zacchaeus sees is a good thing. He's overjoyed. Do you get the sense of the joy of Zacchaeus' response here? This is not some burden that he has to do. This is not some rule he has to follow, and he's sad about it. He is so transformed and overjoyed, he responds by doing this. And you might, I think one way to think about this is that when Jesus says he wants to come to Zacchaeus' house, first of all, Jesus is inviting himself over, which is a kind of a social no-no. But to then imagine them sitting down at the table together, as Jesus does repeatedly with sinners and tax collectors and others, and, faithful religious people and all across the spectrum. As he does that, sitting at a table with somebody is a way of saying signaling approval of that person. That you're willing to be at table with somebody, and they're willing to be at table with you, and we're all on the same level, and we all accept each other. Doesn't mean we accept everything that we all do, but we accept the person. And what seems to be happening here is Zacchaeus is having himself accepted as the person that he is. The crowd doesn't accept him because of what he does. Jesus accepts him because of the person he is, which is a son of Abraham. He too is included. And so another result of that, which is a really interesting detail here, is you might expect maybe some other story where, maybe Jesus comes along and says, if you want to be in the kingdom of God, you can't be a tax collector. You're too compromised with the empire, and you're too much of a danger to your neighbors because you're always tempted to take too much money from them. You can't be a tax collector. But in this story, we don't get any sense that Zacchaeus is no longer going to be a tax collector. What we can sense is happening is that Zacchaeus is confessing the error of his ways in being a corrupt tax collector, and that he perhaps is going to transform the way he does that work from here on. That's a very interesting thing to think about, how any of us have to live within systems and participate in systems that might be unjust or unfair, but could be more just and more fair. And it might be tempted to be a person of faith and think, I have to get away from this unjust system. I can't participate in it. It makes me complicit. It makes me unclean or impure or whatever. Or the people on whatever side of the political spectrum will label me as this bad thing. But maybe Zacchaeus is an example of being transformed to stay in it and to approach it from the kind of asking, how do I do the hard work of changing this system? And, perhaps still not be liked by his neighbors because they see him as being on the bad side of things. But I think that's a powerful way to look at this story. And it tells me, again, there's something going on here of the way Jesus accepts Zacchaeus is empowering Zacchaeus to be more his true self. Not think he has to be something totally different, but be more of his actual self in whatever place he finds himself in life. Now, getting to the Reformation, isn't that what the good news tells us? That God's grace tells us you don't have to radically change where you are in life. You don't have to become pure. You don't have to, abide by the codes of whatever group you're a part of, where everybody says if you don't think this way and talk this way and act this way, you are cast out. You can be exactly where you are. And living by God's grace, then, is a transforming power to be who you are in a new way. To be where you are in a new way. To me, that's just the heart of the power of the good news as Luther understood it and as we strive to live it, because it's speaking to real people in real life. Not many of us can decide, this the way I'm living and the place that I've been put in life is bad, and I can't keep doing it. I need to run away from it all and go do something entirely different, like run off to a monastery or something. Most of us don't have that option. So then, to be empowered to be where we are in life, in whatever vocation or relationships or status of wealth, class, race, to be empowered to be in that in a new way, I think is wonderful. I think it leads to the kind of joy that Zacchaeus exhibits in this story. And it does mean we do things differently because we are changed by that grace and empowered by the Spirit. I mean, if it's a very different story if Jesus had come along and said, Zacchaeus, I want you to give away half of your possessions to the poor. I want you to pay back everyone you cheated 4 times, what you cheated them, and then come back and check in with me, and I'll let you know if you're okay. That would be a more law approach. Now, Jesus does that to somebody else in the Gospel of Luke, but for a different reason, I think, and I'm not going to dwell on that text right now. What Jesus does here is reaches out and embraces Zacchaeus for the person he is by simply saying, I want to be with you. That's where the change comes from. So, when we are doing what we do at our best in the Lutheran Church and in the church in general, we come together and we have this encounter with God, and we claim that Christ is present, saying, I want to be with you where you are right now. Nothing about you has to change, but many things could change when you live with this sense that the person you are, is deeply embraced and loved. I think that's the heart of our good news, and I hope that was a helpful, maybe different reading of Zacchaeus. I'm going to ponder how to think about this some more for Reformation Sunday. I hope you'll join us Sunday worship if you can, in person and online, 10 a.m. We will celebrate in all the ways that we do, humbly and joyfully, what it means to be a part of this 505-year-old tradition called Lutheranism now, which is part of the wider church that we also celebrate, and know that the gospel is not owned by Lutherans, but is celebrated throughout the church. And then the following Sunday is All Saints Sunday, always a very meaningful time to come together and remember those saints near and dear to us, and those who are shining examples in history who have inspired us and loved us. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back next week, and we'll take a look at those texts for All Saints. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful week. If you're in Austin enjoying this beautiful weather, don't take it for granted. Peace.